Our next speaker for today, we have Mr. Altaz Valani, Director, Insights Research from Security Compass. He is currently the Vice Chair of Open Group Security Forum, a member of the Safecode Technical Leadership and CIO Strategy Councils, and also sits on several IEEE working groups at international standards level. His topic for today is Industry 4.0, a confluence of many different technologies and frameworks.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to attend this talk on Industry 4.0, which is a confluence of many different technologies and frameworks. As we go through this presentation, what I'm going to do is just touch at a very high level on what are some of the key technologies, along with some of the frameworks that are being developed in the industry around security and privacy to assist us with Industry 4.0 activities. So my presentation today will really consist of three parts. First is to talk about the different facets of Industry 4.0, and then we're going to take a security perspective. Many times in the discussions that I have, the focus is primarily on speed or integration or supply chain issues, but there's also a security perspective that needs to be added into this as well. And I'll share with you some of the insights that I've been able to gather through my discussions with the industry, with practitioners, and in sitting with industry working groups as well. And then we will conclude with some next steps. Where do we go from here? What are some logical things that we can do in the short term, in the midterm, and in the long term? Let's start by talking about the different technologies and frameworks around Industry 4.0. Hopefully, this will give you an idea of the vast expanse of what Industry 4.0 is all about. It isn't just about one particular aspect of the technology, but it actually encompasses much more than that. So starting at a high level, Industry 4.0 has a digital transformation component to it. If we look at the regulatory landscape, we're seeing the increase in prevalence around cybersecurity and privacy, and we see each of these regulatory regulations and concerns come up really globally and by country and by region. We need to be able to accommodate these things. We also have competitors that are continually evolving, continually improving their products and services, which is a normal part of what we would expect in any ecosystem. However, when it comes to digital transformation, this has been accelerated recently, largely in part with a lot of the remote workforce capabilities that have to be built in. We also have our internal business models that we need to consider. We are moving increasingly towards a digitalization of the business models. How do we accommodate digital delivery and DevSecOps pipelines in order to produce the right features and products so that we can go and accommodate rapidly the needs of our customers across the supply chain? Our business processes are evolving continuously to go in and accommodate this model. And we've got the technologies that are coming in place now to facilitate. And I will show a diagram that demonstrates just how vast this landscape is. Hand in hand with all of this, we have to ensure that the organizational culture accommodates an Industry 4.0 mindset. We've got disruptors, we've got customers and stakeholders that are increasingly demanding products and services that meet their needs in real time. And so on the right-hand side, ultimately what we're looking for is efficiencies in the productivity, hopefully generating new digital revenues based on innovative services or enhancement of existing services, and social benefits insofar as the ability to go in and to very quickly respond to needs that are out there. So at a high level, this is what we're talking about. Now, as I go through my presentation, I'm going to dive successively deeper into what this model entails. So if we look at an architecture of Industry 4.0, at the center, we've got some kind of a trusted platform. Generally, it's a trusted cloud-based platform that could encompass machine to machine. It could be a platform where multiple entities are going in there, and we've got telemetry data that's being provided within this platform. The goal is to take these smart products, smart factory, the big data systems that we've got, and pull all this information in and be able to radiate this information to the right systems and processes and people so that we could go in and make informed decisions. And in so doing, we're generating insights as we go through this across the supply chain. And if we look at this as a total architecture, having all of this loosely coupled is extremely important. So we've got API-driven systems that are now extracting information back and forth. And what becomes really important in a context like this is how do we ensure the resiliency, reliability, and security of this kind of a model? And that's where the challenge is today. So I'll talk a little bit more about all of the different technologies and frameworks that go into this, but at a high level, this is what we are talking about. How do we integrate all of this together and have it work cohesively? Here's what the landscape looked like in 2019 based on research done by IoT Analytics. You'll notice that it's a fairly vast landscape. On the left-hand side, we've got all of the building blocks. And on the right-hand side, we've got all of the supporting technologies. So when we look at the building blocks of Industry 4.0, we're looking at hosting, IoT platforms, there are sensors, there's connectivity, we've got cybersecurity in there, there are system integrators. All of these players need to work together. And on the right-hand side, we've got many different supporting technologies, everything from additive manufacturing to robots to machine vision. We've got things around machine learning that I'll talk about. And the challenge is, how do we get all of this now working together to help us to achieve ultimately the objective of tying back to the business need around Industry 4.0? So before stepping in and looking at each one of these, it's important to take a step back and look at how do we, first of all, construct a feasible architecture to help us understand, out of all of these things that are going on, what's the right approach that we might take. So in order to enable the business, we have to take a layered approach. First of all, we start with the business viewpoint. What is the business looking for? What are their goals? What are their objectives? What is the strategy? And we want to tie in ultimately the implementation or the technology to that business viewpoint. If we don't do this, then what ends up happening is we end up reacting very much to new ideas, new technologies, new concepts that come out, but they don't offer a lot of value back ultimately to the business. So in so doing, we'll talk about the business viewpoint, how we tie that into value streams and business processes, ultimately get down to the functionality, and then get to the implementation itself. What it also means is when we get to the implementation layer, as the implementations continue to evolve and we see new technologies emerging, we could take a look at that from an innovation standpoint and find out ways that we can support the business in constructing even more in terms of novel services and new services that exist and enhancement of existing services. Across the top of this diagram, we see several life cycles. There's a requirements life cycle. We have a development life cycle, a build life cycle, deployment, operations. All of these life cycles need to integrate together. The challenge we see historically is that each of these life cycles operate independently. So while we do have pipelines within them, the information resides within them, we're able to extract information within the pipelines, but we're in an era today where this information needs to be shared across the pipelines. And I'll talk a little bit about the challenges from a business architecture standpoint as to why this has been difficult as we de-silo our organizations and enter into digitalization in Enterprise 4.0. As with any reference architecture, along the right-hand side here, we take a generic reference architecture and eventually evolve that into specific sectoral the architectures. So we might have within an organization, manufacturing, we might deal with transportation. There may be other sectors that come in and intersect with what that reference architecture means. Now, when we look at this multidimensional perspective, it gives us an early indication of the kinds of things that we need to consider when we're looking at Industry 4.0. So it really truly is a confluence of many different activities, many different frameworks, all coming together cohesively. DevOps and DevSecOps has a role to play in this. The question is, how do we get all of this working together? Here's an example of a software factory. Now, the idea of a factory is not new. It dates back to the 1950s even. But the idea is we want to be able to bring together DevSecOps, our CI/CD pipelines. We want to be able to bring together telemetry And in so doing, as we go out and we deliver software and products and services, we've got feedback loops that are coming back into the software factory that allow us to go in now and enhance what we are doing. So we've, for a long time in DevOps, talked about how we have the feedback loop that goes in from dev and ops and it comes back. But that needs to expand to go beyond just the technical domain and also include the business now. And one of the challenges that we've seen is how do you go in and make the technical project level information relevant to the business? They speak in terms of risk and compliance and privacy. On the DevOps side, the conversation is more about features and delivery and bugs. And therein lies the gap. We have a policy that's being mandated by the business, and we've got procedural activities happening at the project level, but somehow these two need to merge together. And that's exactly what is happening with digitalization, with Industry 4.0, as we start to bring all of these aspects together. So when we talk about enabling the business, once we take that layer diagram that I showed earlier, we begin to break it down. And this really in blue shows us at the forefront what we are trying to achieve. Information needs to cut across the organization. So we've got the business, we've got operations, we've got our information systems, we've got our applications, and all of the data is going and flowing across these systems in an integrated way. Now, when we take a look at how systems integrate, generally we find that the semantics are different across each of these business areas. What risk means to the business is very different from what risk means to someone in DevOps. To the business, it may be around business continuity. Risk from a DevOps standpoint could include whether or not we're going to be late for a delivery. Nevertheless, these two, when they come together, we are able to go in and make the translation now so that we can share the information. And in so doing, we've got different stakeholders all contributing to the platform, extracting the right information that they need. And this is the way that we now have DevOps expanding beyond just a technical issue or a technical concern to something that is more across the enterprise. Now, on the top, if you look at it from the perspective of the system itself has to accommodate safety, security, resiliency, privacy, scalability, all of these issues. The challenge in the past has been, when we consider Industry 4.0, how do we take high-level security requirements, for example, those that come from NIST, or that something might come from ISO, or something from OWASP, and how do we inject that into our organizational pipelines and still permit us the opportunity to go in there, share this information in a way that doesn't slow us down? And across the right-hand side, we've got all these cross-cutting functions. How do we connect these together? Can we provide some kind of analytics, telemetry information to pull this in? How do we manage the data, especially when it comes to issues around privacy? And privacy today is not just about concrete, discrete information about a customer or about the user, but it also has to do now with the functionality that the user is engaged in. How do they use the application? How do they use the systems? Those types of things. How do we bring all of this now together? So we've gone from talking about a very high-level architecture to talking about the layered model around a reference architecture as to how you implement that within an organization. And ultimately, now we're starting to get into a reference architecture to build this in. So we're going to still go down a little bit deeper to help us understand how we enable all of these activities together. How does this now integrate with DevSecOps? And this is a very meaningful discussion. So far, in many discussions that I've had, there seems to be a disconnect between what I've just described and where DevSecOps is today. There are, thankfully, groups out there that are working to converge and bring these two domains together. And I'm here to share with you some of those insights. So when we take a look at Industry 4.0, first of all, what does the operating model look like? When we talk about an operating model, it really is about bringing together the stakeholders, looking at the benefits realization, trying to understand what are the services, who's going to benefit from these services, and bringing all of that together. So on the left-hand side, we have a business strategy. The strategy is all about continuous planning. We used to have lengthy sessions to go and have these sort of 5-year plans to discuss things. it becomes very coarse-grained in today's world as we think further out, particularly when it comes to all of the technologies around Industry 4.0. So what we have now is this concept of continuous planning. We have discrete planning. We've got portfolios that are managed in an agile way. Funding happens incrementally. And that's where we've got the business side of it. Now, once we've got the business locked down and we derive from the business strategy and the planning a portfolio of activities and projects that we need to engage in, we then move on to Industry 4.0 systems development. And from a systems development standpoint, with DevOps now, it essentially is continuous everything. So continuous architecture, continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous security, continuous compliance, continuous privacy, and so on and so forth. Imagine now that you're in an Industry 4.0 context and you've got a combination of software and hardware you need to deploy incrementally, and yet at the same time, you've got all of these activities that are coming in from a regulatory standpoint that you need to accommodate. How do we do this? It's not possible to go in there and to have physical deployments happen at every incremental phase. So instead, what we do is we have a concept called twinning. Twinning is the idea of digital twins. And what we do here is we take a physical artifact and we virtualize it. So there may be, for example, a mobile phone. We virtualize that mobile phone with all of the essential features. And then we go in and we run our tests in an agile fashion in that virtual environment. And we try and defer the actual hardware deployment for as long as possible. And in so doing, we are now able to achieve the rate of change that is essential to go in there and accommodate whatever the business needs are. Once we're done with that, using DevOps, we then go in and deploy this into operations. And when we're in operations, this is where the concept of continuous runtime monitoring comes in. So we may take a look and have synthetic monitoring. We may go in and have Symbian monitoring. So many different techniques exist. And with SecOps and with systems operations, we take the information from the operational perspective, and we bring this back into the development phase for continuous improvement. So this is not new in DevOps. What is new, however, is we also take the stuff that's happening in production and we bring that back now to the business. And so the business has an opportunity to better understand where there might be new opportunities for innovation. And this is critical as organizations continue with Industry 4.0 and they look for innovative services and they look for ways to continue to improve. This idea of the feedback loop goes now beyond just dev and ops, but includes the business now as well. So when we talk to the business, normally they speak in terms of risk. What does risk look like? This is oftentimes a foreign concept when we speak to teams that are on the DevOps side. But in a nutshell, this is what it looks like. We've got 3 broad stages. We go in, first of all, and we identify the asset. And then the second step is to go in there and conduct some kind of vulnerability or threat modeling assessment of some type. And then in stage 3, we go in and we conduct some type of risk calculation and management. So ultimately, the goal of a risk assessment is to provide the business with an understanding of the risks that are there in terms that the business can understand according to the assets that are critical to the business, and then offer them some options. Historically, when we've produced something like this from a security perspective, it's perceived as being a blocker. In order for us to do these things, we're going to slow down the business. When in fact, what's happening now is we're shifting the conversation and we're coming alongside the business and enabling the business at this point. So there's a real sense of working together and collaboration between the business and the delivery teams. So in terms of risk, when we consider the asset identifications, we understand what is important to the business. We look at the data flows and we limit the threat modeling, for example, to those systems that are only relevant to what the business is looking for. When we conduct our threat modeling, we then go in, consider the vulnerabilities, and we go through an assessment and we find out what are the attack vectors. And from there, we then come up with some recommendations. These recommendations are put forward to the business. In that discussion, we help them understand what this risk means to them. And when I've had conversations with chief risk officers, for example, they are really looking for information that goes beyond just a subjective criteria, but really is objective and traceable. And that's the stage we're in today. So when we talk about things like the likelihood of an attack, it's a probabilistic model. What's the likelihood of this happening? And what's the likely impact of something like this happening? So risk teams can now take this information, work it into their models, and then prioritize these mitigations and come back at that point to suggest what should be a go, no go from a risk standpoint. And this, keep in mind, is something that we are striving to get done in a continuous manner. So keep in mind the big picture of Industry 4.0. We've got an API-driven center core. We've got all these systems offering telemetry data. We need to bring in compliance. We need to bring in security. We need to manage it from a risk standpoint. And all of this needs to happen fairly rapidly. The challenge historically has been that this has not been happening quickly. And so there's that perception that it's slowing things down. Here we see an example of what eventually comes out of that type of discussion. So on the left-hand side, once again, the confluence of all these technologies. It's everything from intrusion detection, integrity monitoring, patching systems, malware, risk detections. This is just from a security perspective. You can imagine that there's also an operational perspective to this. There's a capital expense perspective to this as well. But when we look in the middle, we see the same layered diagram that we had before, starting off by looking at what are the processes that enable the business, looking at the middleware, and ultimately looking at the physical implementation of these edge devices that we've got. And then on the right-hand side, we take a look at the risks that emerge from this. So on the business level, we might have operational disruption. This is the kind of discussion that needs to happen with the business. It's less about the technical side, more about the impact to revenue and cost. Things like financial fraud, privilege abuses. And then as we get to the middle layer, now we're starting to tap into some of the technical elements, and we get into things like platform hacking, device manipulations, vulnerabilities. And at the very bottom, where we've got the physical devices, we have things like firmware issues, we've got device tampering, we have compromised updates, API manipulations, those types of things. And what we want to do is derive on the right-hand side, what are the specific threats that exist? And we can now use this kind of a model to help us understand where we need to put our focus. Normally, when we think about trying to add security to DevOps, this is the model that comes to play. And this has been quite useful for us. We have our dev team, our ops team, and then we have security as a wrapper around it. What's evolving now when we take a look at Industry 4.0 is this idea that we want to start to add compliance and risk. So this model is useful, largely driven by the technical domain. We need to expand this further now and look at how we can add in additional things from the business so that when they're looking at the investments that are being made, particularly when it comes to security, what's the ROCE or the return on that security investment that's coming through? Is it offering me more resiliency? Can I take my insurance that I've got against a particular asset? Maybe I'm over allocated on the insurance, but if you can assure me that we've got less that we can put from an insurance standpoint, that gives me the opportunity to now deploy that elsewhere for the benefit of the shareholders of the organization. Those are the kinds of discussions that Industry 4.0 begins to kick off. So we've taken a look at a lot of different things, and it can get overwhelming. But the challenge that face us today, you don't need to do this alone. There are frameworks that enable Industry 4.0. For example, Mitre has an attack framework. Attack is a framework that is focused largely at the network level, but that's one perspective, right? So, I'll talk about some additional perspectives coming up. But here we can have things like, for example, active scanning. We may have things related to looking at forging some kind of credentials, looking at cloud infrastructure issues that come up. So there's been some great work that's already been put together by Mitre. So you can use this as you consider your platform and your architecture to consider what might be some potential areas when it comes to vulnerabilities that you want to think about from a risk standpoint. Now, keep in mind, this is something that is largely driven by a technical mindset. This needs to ultimately make its way up into the business language. And in recent discussions, I've been a part of the Mitre discussions, and we are discussing at this point how we might be able to integrate some of this work with what's happening on the business side. It is recognized across the industry that that gap exists, and we need to be able to go in there and help to bridge that gap. And there are emerging balanced development architectures and platforms that are helping to address that need. Nevertheless, if you take a look at this, it gives you some idea of where you can start. Not all of these will apply to every context. It depends on the organizational appetite. It depends on the risk, depends on a number of different things. So if we move forward and take a look at CWEs, this is something that Mitre has had for some time. They've expanded the application side to also include things on the hardware side. So when we look at the hardware side, these are some of the things you might want to consider, looking at things like core issues, compute issues, security flow issues, manufacturing and lifecycle management issues, for example. But there is work that has already been done to assist with that. We also have, when it comes to machine learning, there's work that's already being done by Mitre and others to go in and consider how do we look at some of the issues when it comes to machine learning. So things like model poisoning, for example, or model stealing. We've got denial of services. We've got data set integrity issues that come in. All these things need to be considered as you think about how you implement your Industry 4.0. We also have privacy issues, and Linden is a framework that helps us understand what are the different ways that we might want to consider where vulnerabilities around privacy might emerge. So they've come up with several trees, and we can use that to gain a better understanding of the privacy issues. So we are in fact seeing the convergence of privacy within software development. We've already seen the convergence of compliance in software development. And now when we try and take a look at Industry 4.0, it goes much broader than that to include a lot of the privacy issues that emerge from that. Keep in mind that these frameworks are useful not only to go in there and understand what your vulnerabilities might be, but also in terms of training and helping to foster and build a culture that helps you with that. Ultimately, we end up with something that looks like this, which is about the architecture and the design. How could we go in there and reduce the attack surface? How do we go in and manage our containers and virtualizations to go in there and help reduce that vulnerability? So again, this is very useful from a runbook perspective as we consider a lot of the modern architectures in the DevOps space around microservices and things like that. How do we go in there now and manage this to facilitate and enable an organization's ability to manage Industry 4.0? So what are the next steps now? How do we emerge from where we are to where we need to go? First of all, start with the big picture. Let's simplify what we've got into a framework that is manageable. We've got three different perspectives to look at. We've got capabilities, and these could be knowledge management, asset management, auditing capabilities, modeling capabilities. Many of these we spoke about earlier. It's not enough just to build these capabilities. We need to ensure that these capabilities are aligned to the business strategy. So looking at the business, the value stream, the processes, and the information systems that align all of this together. And finally, looking at how this helps us manage across different stakeholder groups. In Industry 4.0, we're going to expand this not just within the organization, but across the organization as we deal with supply chain as well. So what does it mean when we've got different teams working, for example, on security issues at the firmware level? And we need to incorporate this eventually into a system that a manager in a different part of the value stream of the supply chain needs to take a look at. How are we going to integrate all of these together? So this is the kind of model that we need to think about. Let's put this together and say, okay, this now represents the big picture of all the things that we need to think about. It doesn't mean we have to do all of it. It just means that it gives us a starting point to understand where are we today and what's a reasonable next step to help us move forward. You should anticipate certain challenges. So when it comes to the idea of industrial digital transformation, Industry 4.0, many times these issues emerge. The business may not pay attention to or provide oversight of the industrial digital transformation. So you need to ensure that you get that alignment. What are they looking for? Why is there a gap? Is it something that perhaps from a KPI standpoint, we need to ensure that Industry 4.0 is able to provide them, the various initiatives that we're undertaking? Similarly, we've got a mismatch of planning versus doing. There's this improper use of MVPs and the lessons learned from moving quickly and failing fast. As we integrate all of these systems together, we're going to be replacing components. We're going to have data that's going to come in. We're going to ask for enhancement to these services, all being done in a rapid form, digital delivery kind of operating model. So as we look at this, sometimes there's pushback from various teams to suggest that if there's any kind of governance or oversight, that it means that we're going to move away from agility. That's not the case at all. In fact, we need to have some level of oversight if we're going to coordinate our activities. Does that imply some overhead? Yes, it does. But if we're going to integrate something as complex as the components of Industry 4.0, we have to make sure that we are able to get everybody working together. And semantically, we've got all of the entities across and all of the data extractions across these various systems are in fact coming up and providing meaningful information. Sometimes there's too much emphasis on the technology, not enough on the cultural shift. So we oftentimes see a lot of emphasis on getting the project going. And then ultimately, because there's a cultural barrier, it's very difficult to start to move forward. And there's only so far that Industry 4.0 is able to go in there and make an impact within an organization. There's also difficulty in accepting just new disruptive ideas. We see this with cloud adoption, microservices, containers. It's a change in the process. It's a change in the mindset. How do we still go in there and enable all of this from a cultural standpoint, from a training perspective as well? There are also interdisciplinary approaches that support creativity. Normally, we talk about de-siloing an organization, but as we de-silo an organization, there are some changes that come alongside that. And the final thing here is that there seems to be this idea of always being in proof of concept. We never really operationalize anything. We try it, we experiment, it's good. We try some more, we experiment, try some more, but nothing ever makes its way out into production. And so there's a degree of patience that's required to go in there and ultimately get that initial win, pull from that win, and then help us move forward. When you assess your industry gaps, it's not uncommon to go through an exercise like this. Assess your current state. Maybe the security you've got is reactive. There are siloed operations. There's a lack of integration with risk. And so there's no clear connection with the business. In the future, you want to have a proactive security model, cross-functional security, feedback loops. And the change gap that exists is then identified. We have knowledge sharing gaps. We don't have an integrated risk platform. And then we determine what the barriers to those changes are. It may be a lack of expertise. It may be resistance from a managerial perspective. And from that, we derive what are the change activities to help us move forward. So Industry 4.0 is becoming less and less now about the technology and more about trying to accommodate the culture and helping to bring the business alongside as we move forward. Here's an example of the kind of architecture that may evolve from that. So we did we basically put in a room together some practitioners. There were about 8 of us and came up with this idea of trying to understand from different perspectives. We had people from a CISO in there. We had people in there from a development perspective. We had people from a risk perspective. And this is what we were looking at. When you look at each of these various pieces of data around threats or weaknesses or auditability or requirements, where does all of this information sit? It might sit in a controls catalog somewhere. It might sit in a risk management system somewhere. It might sit in a SIEM somewhere. And this is part of the problem. We've got many systems, but they are not integrated yet at this point, not effectively anyway. So we want to be able to integrate all of these together so that ultimately we're able to provide the business with real-time or at least near real-time insights into what's the risk level. And at any point in time, we can now go in there and make informed decisions. Not only that, but we end up with a red, yellow, green status on deployments. If something goes and we run through our CI/CD pipelines, some kind of assessment from a security, compliance, risk perspective, and determine that it exceeds our threshold, we pause, we stop it, we go back, we reassess. Maybe there's some training that needs to be done. Maybe we need to reduce the feature set, whatever that issue is, we solve it, and then we move forward. And so this is what we mean by having many different stakeholders coming together across different levels, not just at the practitioner level, but also at the managerial level and as well from the executive level. And bringing all of this together is where many of the discussions that I've been having in the industry with practitioners and standards working groups, this is where we're headed right now. It is a recognized problem. Many organizations are facing this. How do we bring all of these control systems, our SCADA systems, our industrial control paradigms into an integrated model with DevOps and DevSecOps to help us achieve what we're looking for from an Industry 4.0 perspective. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. If you've got any additional questions, feel free. I'll be monitoring the chat and be more than happy to answer that for you. Thank you.